All right, so now I want to review the book, The Case Against Education, Why the Education System is a Waste of Time and Money by Brian Caplan. Brian Caplan, famous anarcho-capitalist, relatively speaking, probably best known for his book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, which is excellent, which I think I did a review 10 years ago at this point. He also has a book titled Selfish Reasons to Have More Children or More Kids. He has four kids himself. Also was college friends with Michael Huemer, who's The Problem with Political Authorities, I think probably the best philosophical defense slash argument for anarcho-capitalism or libertarian ethics. The two of them are apparently friends, or at least were friends for a long time. And He's kind of a quirky guy. His character's a little weird, but that's fine. I think that goes with the territory. And in the book, he tries to reconcile two things that are widely known. One is that the stuff that you learn in school you never really use in work, and yet the empirical data seems to suggest that people who do go to school, and this is true of high school and college both, make a lot more money. So what is the reason for that? Now, education, public education, is something very much part of the civic religion, and he makes a point that's not simply true in the United States. Pretty much every government everywhere says that they value education and that they want to give more money to education, right? The Russian state says that they value education and they want to give more money to education. All the European states say this. All the Latin American states say this. African states say this. India says this. China says this. Japan says this. You might be able to find an example like the Taliban, who maybe say they don't want to educate women, but they don't want to not educate everyone, right? It's just kind of a shibboleth. And then the more you subsidize it, the better. The more money you get to it, the more schools, the more teachers, all these things are good. But the problems come when you start to analyze what are people being taught and what are people actually using when they work. If you look at the subjects, the vast majority of subjects, the vast majority of your time, and when I say vast, I mean over 50% more, like 80%, 90%, are things you aren't going to learn. So if you are in the United States, any time you spend learning a foreign language is probably a waste if we're talking about in terms of marketable skills. Unless you become a translator or you go into business in one of those other countries, you will never need to know those languages. You'll never need to know Spanish or French. English is the lingua franca of the world. It's the language of business. It's the language of travel. It's the language of science. If you're fluent in English, you have a huge advantage over people who are not. And so anytime on that. The same is true with almost all the other topics. Also, if you look at people who have careers, if you go and you survey people and ask them what do they use from their high school or their college, it's very, very little. And the other thing is that we also just know that people don't remember the stuff that they learn, right? It's something like 80% of what you learn for a test is forgotten within a few weeks after the test. The only exception is if it's something that you continue to use on a regular basis. The reason people have all kinds of skills in work. I mean, there's some skills, some jobs have more skills, some others. But when you have a job that requires skills, people practice those skills and they get better and better and better at them over time. And so the things that they do use, they keep. The things that they use typically don't have their roots in school, other than past the most basic things like literacy and basic numeracy. I think that numeracy even, most people don't even use algebra and will never use algebra. Yes, there's certain careers where that's true, but they're quite rare. Everybody kind of intuitively knows that. Everybody understands that, and it's even kind of admitted by researchers, even the proponents of education. I mean, when they're making platitudes, when they're making arguments, rhetorically, they will say, oh, you learn all these important skills and this important information, but then the truth is that it's not. But then what they'll point to is that there's a high correlation between people who have a high school diploma or a college degree and their earning potential. They seem to earn more money. And what he's trying to do in this book, and I think what he does a really good job at, is showing what you're getting paid for, what you're earning, what the benefit is to you, the selfish benefit to you from that education is not the stuff that you learn, it's the signaling. This idea that by earning a diploma, whether it's at the high school level or the college level, you are signaling to employers certain qualities that they like, not specific information per se. You're not signaling when you get a diploma that you know calculus and you can speak French and you know social studies, whatever the fuck that means, or you can play an instrument or you're good at football. You're signaling that I'm a hard worker, that I'm dutiful, that I'm obedient, that I'm submissive, that I can take orders, that I can do tedious things, and I can jump through hoops, and that's valuable. Like now, you will of course find examples of companies or entrepreneurs say we want people, we want go-getters, we want free thinkers, we want people, and that's absolutely true. You do need that in certain things. As an entrepreneur, you need that, right? As an entrepreneur, you need to be able to do that kind of stuff as in addition to all the work and all the diligence and tediousness as well. But for most jobs, you don't want that. You don't want somebody who's a go-getter, who's a free thinker, or at least if they are a free thinker, they know how to contain it and focus on being obedient and doing what they're told. And so that's what you're really getting when you get a high school or a college diploma for the most part. There is some stuff that is actually maybe useful, and he goes through the numbers. There's a lot of calculations. It's not exactly easy to come to. But he says that the best guess is that about 80% of the time, money, and effort or the value. 80% of the value is from signaling, and about 20% is from actually learning stuff. And most of that stuff is the stuff you learn very early: reading, numeracy, basic stuff. It's not the higher level courses by and large. Again, this is on average. So there's this effect called a sheepskin effect. And I think we all intuitively understand this. You take, if it wasn't signaling, if it was actually learning things and becoming knowledgeable, gaining a job skill, then this is a good illustration, hypothetical scenario. So you've got a person who's the best student in college, right? They get the best grades. They teacher's pet. They learn everything. They know the material really well. Whatever the major is, it doesn't matter. They know the material better than anyone else in the class. They really know it extremely well, and they're very diligent. And then it's the last semester, last year. They have one more final they have to take. They're doing great, but they do have to take the final. If they don't take the final, they will fail the class, and they will not graduate at that time. And let's say going on their way to their final, something happens, there's a family emergency, maybe a relative gets sick or in a dire situation, they leave to go take care of their situation, they miss the test, they fail, they do not pass, they do not graduate. Now, and perhaps they make the decision, well, I don't want to spend another semester, I don't want to spend another 25,000 or 35,000 or whatever they're going at, right? And they think, well, look, I already took all the classes. The test by itself, by definition, doesn't teach you anything, right? There's the saying among farmers, you don't fatten a pig by weighing it. You don't get smarter by taking a test. This isn't like an ordeal test that's challenging you and you're going to get character out of it the way you might have, say, a test of physical endurance or some other kind of challenge like that. This is just an administrative assessment of whether you've retained the knowledge or not. You don't learn anything from that effect. So you're not any smarter because you took the test. And by not taking the test, you're not any dumber, and you don't miss any of the skills. Any of the information that was there, you learned all of it, but you didn't take the test, you didn't graduate. Versus another person who doesn't learn any of the stuff, just passes the test, but he does graduate. Are these two people equivalent? No. The person who graduates has a huge benefit. It's something, and I'm not going to remember the numbers off the top of my head because there's no test and I didn't learn it well enough and whatever. But make of that as you will. But there's employers are going to look at that and just say we're going to pick the person who graduated. The person who doesn't graduate conveys something that they're a renegade, that they don't follow the rules, they don't believe in the rules. If they had good grades up to that point, or they have other things that demonstrate their intelligence, maybe they have GET tests, maybe they can come and say, look, I didn't go to college, but look, here's a certified IQ test. It's proven, I have a really high IQ. Well, that's even worse because then it shows somebody who is very intelligent, but then is a deviant, right? They've decided they don't want to go the normal route like everybody else. They want to do their own thing, and they don't care about norms, and they don't care about rules. So actually, that's maybe not somebody we want to hire. Now, obviously, that doesn't tell everything, and I think anybody who would be asked would know that. An employer could understand, hey, this picture isn't complete. This person really does know everything, and they just didn't get the diploma because their mom died, and they had to go and take care of them instead. But employers have a finite amount of resources. They have a finite amount of time. and they can't go and sift through every single application, every single person all the time. And so this is a mechanism that they can use. And the other thing that kind of gives it a quality is that it's universal, more or less. The fact that everybody does it. It would be one thing if we had a polycentric system and there were many different avenues that people took, and there was 20% of the population that just never went to school at all. There's another 20% that did homeschool. There's a certain percent, 20% that did apprenticeships and whatnot, and then maybe I had 10-15% who did actually go to school. Well, then you wouldn't really have the value of the gauge then, because you just know the large percentage of people are not going, they're not being subjected to that, and so it doesn't become a standard. The whole point is having it be a standard. It's almost like any single thing that you apply to everybody would suddenly become useful in that regard. Instead of having school or tests, we just had a massive spelling bee that every single person had to be in. Okay, then that would tell you, like, where did you rank in the spelling bee? It doesn't matter if spelling is valuable or not valuable. The fact that we now have a uniform metric over, essentially all of the population makes it valuable. This effect of getting the diploma and getting the gold star and showing what you did is called the sheepskin effect, right? It's the value of the diploma, the value of the degree is the degree itself. It's not necessarily the knowledge. The knowledge is there a little bit, but it's only about 20%, and a lot of it, all the other, people will also talk about other things, getting socialized, gaining a worldview, getting a view of an appreciation of like the finer things in the world. And he does a pretty good job of saying, well, if you look at the consumer demand for things like classical music, poetry, drama, the market demand for those is extremely small. I think the sales of classical music, in terms of revenue, in terms of their market share of what people spend on music, is something like 0.3% or 0.4%. It's absolutely minuscule. The same is true for how much is being spent on poetry or on going to drama. Yes, there's plays and people, but all musicals and all plays put together, the lion's share of that is going to go to what's really popular. It's going to be Wicked or Phantom of the Opera or the Book of Mormon. People are probably not going to go watch a Xenophon play, But even if you were to take all of those put together and then just assume that 100% of that was because of people's education, right? That all the classical music sales that we have are because of high school band and music programs and because of college music appreciation classes and whatnot. Well, then you would be saying that the net effect of that is trivially tiny, right? It's not really doing that. Of course, it's also just probably completely wrong to assume that 100% of the interest in classical music comes from education. It probably doesn't. But even if you just want to steelman the argument, say, oh, it's all from that, it's so minuscule to say the effect is so tiny that it's kind of pointless. These people are into these things or not into these things. And subjecting them to school just doesn't work. You can always say hypothetically, well, I can imagine somebody who doesn't care about those things and they go to school and they get inspired by a great teacher. And he acknowledges great teachers exist. And we all can think about teachers that we thought were great. It's very easy to do. If I was less introspective and somebody asked me about my high school or my middle school experience, my head is going to go to the teachers who impacted me the most, who I respected and who I thought who did a great job. And there were a couple who fell into that category. But then you think longer, but there were many other teachers every single day who, for every great teacher, there was at least one or two who was downright terrible, who didn't know anything, who was an idiot, who had antisocial behaviors or strange behaviors. And then there were many more who were just completely apathetic or that didn't really care. I remember one in particular. You could tell that he was completely phoning it in. His lesson plans were handwritten in Xerox, and you could tell based on some of the dates and some of the things on there that they were the same notes, the same syllabus that he'd had for 15 or 20 years at that point. It was just dialing it in. But what he was really, really animated focused and interested in his union politics. What is the NEA doing? What is the MEA doing? Contract, like that's something. And Grant, okay, fine, he's into that, whatever. But then, as a teacher, there was nothing about him that was special at all. I mean, it's just totally forgettable. And what value did anyone? I don't remember anything that I learned in his class, and there's nothing in his class that I ever used again. And it wasn't just me; it was literally every student that he ever had, in all likelihood. So his entire career, his entire salary for 30 years, whatever it was, all of his health care benefits, all of that, the net effect in terms of enlightenment, in terms of raising the intellectual status of a single kid is zero. Right. So the anecdotal great teachers who inspire, even the great teachers don't inspire the vast majority of their students. And that's just the fact. I mean, when I was studying education in college, we lamented and debated why education doesn't seem to work with poor people. When you have people from certain cultures and certain socioeconomic statuses, what do you, and the thing is, I think that it was worse than they thought. If you take a bunch of poor people from, a high time preference culture and you force them through compulsion to go to high school, yeah, the vast majority of them aren't going to learn anything. And you could say, but it does work for middle class people, right? We have public schools, and there's public schools for, suburban communities, and it serves them really well. Those schools look nice. They are well kept. Typically, the students are studious, and they go and they study and they get grades and whatnot. Isn't well, so it works for them, right? Yeah, but those people obviously come from a place that values education, that values learning, that values obedience, or whatever the qualities are. And so if you didn't have the school there, those qualities, those cultural traits would still exist, and they would still have all the education that they want and need. And so his net kind of takeaway is that we have way, way, way more than we need, that we should at least not be mandating people go to college or encouraging people to go to college. He does make the case that if you are a very good student, if you're somebody who is thriving in high school and getting very good grades, and you know that you want to pursue something that requires a degree, and you're confident that you can do it under the right price, then it might make sense. But we have to look at the odds that you don't complete. It's something like 25% of men don't graduate high school once they start. And for college, it's about 50%. So there's about a 50% chance that when you go to college, that you won't graduate. I did graduate, but I almost didn't graduate. It took a long time. I thought about quitting repeatedly. Economically, it made sense for me to get the diploma. And I'm actually kind of a good case. My diploma is basically worthless in terms of like a remunerative. It's not STEM. It's not something where people are going to go, oh, wow, that degree. I have a bachelor's of arts in music. So even among music degrees, it's the worst one that you can get. But just getting it gives you a sheepskin effect. Oh, he can sit through classes and do what he's told and get high enough grades that there's enough cognitive ability there that like he can probably understand basic stuff. Okay, that's great. I will look at I'll consider your application more so than the person who just doesn't have that. Or even if they come and say I have a GED or whatever, this, yeah, that person maybe is deviant or whatever. And like, yeah, if you want to do a startup and you're going to compete entrepreneurially, then maybe you want that other person. But if you have a desk job in an office, or you're going to have a manager over you, or you're going to have somebody telling you what to do, or you're going to have delegated authority and menial tasks or repetitive tasks, even if they require a little mental acuity, that's not what you want. You want submission, obedience, conformity, right? And so that is what you're judging, not intellectual stimulation, not the glories of pedagogy, not high culture. These are tastes that you develop on your own, through your family, through your peers. Schools don't really foster them. They foist them on a lot of people. And yes, the people who are already into them will use them and be into them, but otherwise, no, it's a huge wasted effort. And so, and this is kind of my default where I'm kind of coming my compromise. Obviously, we shouldn't have the government subsidizing any of this. Government shouldn't be paying for schools. This idea that, well, we need them for poor people. A, they don't work for poor people. It's just a fact. Yes, you can find examples here and there, but for the vast majority, it doesn't do anything for them except for waste their time. And then their presence is an irritation for everybody else who maybe could benefit or might want to benefit. But then the other thing is uh, they don't want it, they don't need it, and it doesn't do any good. So, uh, and it's interesting too now that this to say it's for poor people, that's an argument to have a welfare-based school system. That's an argument to say, well, yes, obviously rich people can afford to do what they want. Rich people can pay for tutors. Rich people can pay for private school. Rich people can afford to do homeschooling. So, I mean, obviously we don't have to have subsidies to have compulsory schooling for rich people. That's also true for middle class people, right? Right? Because education isn't so incredibly expensive that you can't pay for private schools, that you can't pay for private tutors, and that you can't homeschool. Homeschooling is the thing that may mean really long term may break the bank on this. Homeschooling is, by the way, also what Brian Caplan has done with the most of his kids. It's kind of tentative at first. If you go into, I went and looked into this a little bit. He homeschooled his twin boys. His sounds like his wife insisted that they go back to school briefly, like around ninth grade, and they hated it. Went right back to homeschool, and they've done pretty well. And now I think he's doing it with the rest of his two other younger children, a boy and a girl. I think even they might be done with high school at this point. I'm not following it that close, but um, even I mean, middle class people can homeschool. Middle class people, and for a fraction of the cost, and they can afford private schools, especially if private schools were deregulated and cost a lot less, and especially if they weren't being forced to pay the tax burden to subsidize the public schools. Poor people, obviously, you're talking about a situation where those people probably don't have money for private tuition. Now, obviously, there's lots of private schools that have charity. There's all kinds of grants and things available, but let's just say that there are going to be people who don't qualify or aren't able to get them. Poor people can do homeschooling. This has been studied pretty well. They do. It's possible, but you have to have a parent, at least one, or a guardian of some kind. It doesn't have to be the parent. It could be a grandparent or another relative who wants to do it and is invested in it. If you have a group that even if they're poor, but they value education, they can achieve education. Thomas Sowell and I think Robert Higgs also talks about this. When slavery ended in 1865 in the United States, the literacy rate among African Americans, among blacks, was essentially zero. And within a generation, it was 50%. And that wasn't because of schools, of public schools, because they weren't given public schools. Public schools were not universally available or mandated even for white children until the first decades of the 20th century. And they were never great for black children right where they lived. But because that was a culture that wanted to rise up from slavery, and they thought that literacy was a big part of that, probably because the masters trying to prevent them from learning it. I mean, so they didn't want them to be able to read and write, and they didn't want them to have guns. And so what did the free blacks want more than anything? They wanted to read and write, and they wanted to have guns. Uh, uh, they were able to jump their literacy, from 0 to 50% in like a generation, even though they would have been unbelievably poor and the resources available to them would be non-existent today. I mean, a poor person today has the internet, so um, now, if you have a family that's poor and they don't care about education, they don't give a shit about it, they're whatever, they're drug addicts, they're criminals, uh, that's a really bad situation, and that kid is screwed. I mean, there's no reliable way to assume that child of that family in that situation is going to become a scholar or get a great education. And you can make a public school available to them, and they can go, and statistically you will not help them at all. They will almost certainly drop out. Even if they don't drop out, they're probably not going to learn anything. uh, and this is again the big secret and this also will be admitted. All right, so the teachers unions, who when they're promoting themselves and when they're feeling self-righteous will, tell you that everything is owed to them. Teachers make everything possible. Teachers are the wellspring of all knowledge and all existence and all good and glory and democracy and blah blah blah. It's because that they teach and invade the kids to be a certain way. And then you start pulling out the numbers and saying, like, oh, these kids aren't even literate, they don't know anything, they're criminals, they drop out all the time. And then the honesty comes down, like, well, actually, I mean, there's nothing we can do if the family and the culture and the economics and, however they want to word it. But then suddenly, not only is it not their fault, that they have no control, that it's just something that their presence is completely irrelevant. A child is going to sink or swim based on factors that are totally unrelated to the school and certainly unrelated to the union. And so really, you can't blame them for all this illiteracy. You can't blame them for, whatever the standard is that, the average eighth grader can't name the president or point out their state or, whatever the metric is. But they're not fault, and there's a broader kind of government point where they're just never responsible. It doesn't matter how bad they fail. It's not their fault. They just need more money and more power. But even ignoring that, saying, well, what about poor people? That is not an argument for compulsory education for everyone. That is an argument for welfare schools. Rich people, middle class people, it should be on them. They want to have school. They want to have education. They can do homeschool. They can do private school. They can do nothing. They can do tutoring. Up to them. If you want to say, what about the poor person whose family is bad, who's whatever, single mom who's going whatever, okay, yeah, then have charity schools be available for those people if they need them. Don't make it compulsory for everybody else. I don't think it's going to work. It's going to waste a lot of money. It's not going to help the people. I mean, it's just not a viable way to help the people it's intended, at least en masse or at scale. Obviously, you can find exceptions. You could find somebody. The problem there, though, is like you say, well, look at this kid. Yes, his family is really messed up and they have all these problems, but we got him in school and he's doing great. Well, if he's really motivated to do great for whatever reason, he or she, then chances are they'll find a way whether or not you give them the subsidy. This is the same thing with jobs programs for poor people. If you have somebody who's really wants to work, who's eager to work and willing to work, then they'll find a way. They don't need a jobs program. And if you have somebody who's not willing to do those things and you give them a jobs program, well, if you give them an incentive to be in the jobs program, like you give them a stipend while they're in it, then they'll do it. And then when the stipend ends, they'll just go back on welfare or whatever. I mean, that's also been studied repeatedly, including by the federal government back when it was investigating whether it should get into welfare. And it made these findings, but then, of course, the bureaucrats who want to have jobs distributing welfare said, screw the empiricism. I want to have a job and feel good about myself, so we're going to have this program. And all the virtue signaling voters went along with it. So, yeah, there really isn't there's an argument for charity schools, and then there's an argument for maybe elementary school just so the parents can work, babysitting basically. When you have children that are too young to be left alone or to take care of themselves, even in short intervals when their parents are, busy working or whatever, then you could say, well, the public schools are raising the productivity of the society because they're basically doing childcare. But that you could just retool it that way then and save a ton of money. Just have it be organized recess. You don't need as many teachers. You don't need, the facilities could be much more simplified and far less, far cheaper. But if you just think, I was thinking about this the other day, Hooked on Phonics was the big thing when I was growing up, and I don't personally know, is that effective pedagogy or not? It had pretty good reviews. But let's just say hypothetically that there was a program that did exist that you could show was, very effective, and that, having a student use this program would, get them whatever level of literacy and numeracy, whatever the metric is. Right? It doesn't matter the subject, whatever. And that all you have to do is, give them the book, give them the program, or give them the computer program, whatever it is, and they're going to learn the material, as good or better than any metric in any school. But the only thing is that it will require far fewer teacher hours, that the number of teachers will be cut by half. Okay, so like you just don't need as much teacher input because the program runs itself. Would that ever be implemented? Would that ever be allowed? No, absolutely not. Al Shanker was the longtime head of the AFL-CIO. or I'm sorry, the American Federation of Teachers, are the second big teachers union. The NEA is the big one. This is the American Federations of Teachers is the other one. And he said he would start to care about students when students started to pay dues. Students don't pay dues. The point of the unions is to benefit the teachers. They will not allow anything that's good for students if it's bad for teachers. If there is a program that can educate the students better and faster and cheaper, but it doesn't make teachers get more money or have there be more teachers, then it's bad. Okay, if it was to be discovered that really kids get all the information they need by the end of 10th grade instead of 12th grade, and so we could save a ton of money by just ending high school in 10th grade instead of 12th grade. And they could join the workforce faster. They don't really learn anything those last 2 years, whatever. If this could be proven beyond any doubt, and it kind of already can be because people won't use the stuff that they learn at any point after elementary school once they can read and write, the unions would totally oppose it. And it's not just that. They don't allow meritocracy. They don't even allow, and I made a video on teacher unions before. Sorry if this is getting repetitive, but it just bears emphasis because it shows that the institution, the system is not really there for what it advertises itself to be. It's a government program. It's for government workers. There is an idea, and it's popular among a lot of libertarians, that this is obviously the government wants to fund schools because it wants to control how people think. There are definitely people in government who view it that way. There's definitely people who progressives who want to shape the world, who see that the school system is an instrument to use in that way, and they try to, and this does make it into curriculum, and you do see these effects. The good news is they're just so bad that they don't seem to be effective at doing that. Now, that doesn't mean it's not bad that they're trying and they're wasting time and money to do it. It is bad, and some of that stuff does stick, and that's not a good thing either. But the good news is they're really, really, really ineffective at doing this, where the rubber meets the road. And hopefully they always will be. So, obviously the ideal solution is just that there should be no subsidy whatsoever. People should be able to decide for themselves how much education they need or want, and then also what kind. There are also a host of, even if we didn't have the unions, even if we didn't have corruption, even if we had a perfectly beneficent state and a perfectly beneficent educational association or institution, they would just lack the knowledge. It would be very difficult. If two different people have, different desires, different proclivities, different circumstances, they're not going to want, need, or benefit from the same education. They're probably going to want something different. Well, then how does the state provide that to them? If it logistically very difficult to assess that for every single individual, probably impossible. But even if they did, hypothetically, again, I'm making, this is steal as steely argument as I can. You would have a situation where one student receives something very different than the other student, and those different things, just by virtue of their being different, they're not going to cost the same, they're not going to entail the same, and so it's not going to be equal. You're going to have the state saying, well, Johnny here, his tailored education is this, and it's going to cost $40,000 a year, and Max here, his curtailed education, it's different. It's only going to cost $23,000 a year. Well, how fair is that? It's not. And if you say, well, let's just make it equal to everyone, we spend $10,000 per student per year. Okay, but then obviously there's no tailoring at all, and the service that you receive is not the same. So you might have some students, well, $10,000 is kind of close to enough, and you have others that's not near enough, or that's far too much. So really the only fair thing is to abolish it altogether. Or if we're going to compromise, maybe we have elementary school so the parents can work, and then after that, it's on their own recognizance, and maybe we provide charity schools here and there for those who really think that they want them and can't get them some other way. Again, I don't think any of that, that's the compromise position as far as I'm concerned. I don't see this happening. Homeschooling is obviously throwing a wrench in all of this, because it obviously is, in terms of any academic standard, it's at least as good. They score, if the tests are meant to gauge how effective the education is, then it's as good or better. Uh, and there isn't really another metric to go at. I mean, public school teachers will fall back. Public school proponents, not just the teachers, will fall back when confronted with it. I mean, the data on this is there's no counter data to this. There's no studies, none, good or bad, that show that if you that homeschool kids do worse on tests. Um, I mean, there's questions about, in general, the validity of tests generally. That's a perfectly, and I think I did a video on that called the measuring up. Um, but that is the metrics that the public schools use. So, using those same metrics, it's just as good. And then if you factor in like how much it costs, it's far, far, far less. And so you're getting as good or better results for a fraction of the cost. It's hard not to see how that's better. Now, the fallback is that, well, there's some kind of socialization that happens at schools that doesn't happen in homeschools. This assumes that the homeschoolers are not having any other interactions. It also assumes that the interactions you have in public school are somehow idealized or optimal, and I think that that's quite a big assumption on both parts. Homeschool kids might be isolated away from everybody else. That can happen, but probably not. They're probably playing sports. They're probably in youth groups, whether it be Boy Scouts or church groups. It's now become very easy, easier anyway, as homeschooling has grown more popular, and through social media that they can organize things and have homeschool bands and homeschool basketball teams and whatnot, homeschool playtime, whatever the case may be. Uh, and so it's caused a problem. It's kind of interesting. I wish Brian would talk about this a little bit more. So his first two sons, they spoke absolutely fluent Spanish, which is ironic given how much he criticized education. But, they decided they wanted to go to college, and colleges were saying you needed that. So they went, they jumped in with 2 feet. He said that they were fluently speaking with each other in exclusively Spanish after like 9 weeks of study. He got them a tutor, like they really went on. They had a history podcast. They had published a paper on I think it was the Mormon schism that happened in Mexico in the 80s or something. I haven't read it or anything, but they wanted to pursue and go into college, so they applied to a lot of places. They did get accepted, and they went to / are going to Vanderbilt, which I guess is a good school. Not one that I know much about. Interestingly, he said they did apply to some Ivy places like Harvard, and they weren't denied, but the application was simply never replied to, which is interesting. Based on their demonstrable accomplishments that they can put, that they can document, it seems like they would be well qualified by any standard to go to these schools. And yet it seems that there's some reticence on the part of some of these institutions. But and he said he looked into this. He's very worried. Apparently, he mentions this in the book. So this is not private information. He talks about it in the book. He was worried that his sons would be discriminated against, and they probably were by Harvard. But he said that as it's become more common, it's become less taboo, and the discrimination against homeschoolers has kind of lessened a great deal as time has gone on. It's still not none. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't be going to Vanderbilt. They'd probably be going to one of the Ivies. Probably. I mean, who's to say for sure? I mean, Harvard can always fall back. Like, oh, we didn't pick them for it. It might just be that they weren't Chinese or they weren't black. Yeah, if they'd been Chinese, they definitely couldn't have gone. So that's interesting. I think that the homeschooling, though, will erode at the monolith. The appeal that this is a uniform thing that everyone has to deal with, that will kind of decline. Whether it will reach a breaking point or a critical point, I don't know. I think that given the funding, that fiscal considerations are going to have to trump this. The only other thing would be some kind of lowering of the voting age. If franchisement could be extended lower, which some people talk about extending it to 16, that would definitely raise questions about requiring people to, they can vote, they have legal rights, but they can be forced to go to school. Doesn't make sense. other than that, and some radical thing happening, I don't see how this is going to change anytime soon. But here's to hoping. Anyway, so yeah, hope you guys found that interesting. If you're going to have kids, I mean, there are selfish economic reasons for them to go to public schools. It's not necessarily the end of the world. It's not great. It's kind of like get it over with, get the diploma, get out. That's it. Which, I mean, ironically, that was exactly the advice I was given by my relatives. Just get the diploma and get out. Doesn't matter what you learn or retain. It's just the sheepskin, which is totally asinine. Wow, I'm spending a lot of money for that sheepskin, and I don't even get an actual sheepskin at the end. So, all right. Well, thank you all, and have a good day.